What's up, everybody? I'm Noah Krachivik, and welcome to another episode of Real Talk. This is an ongoing series I'm going to be doing where we just focus on the real way we talk to each other, our coworkers, our friends, our family, all that kind of stuff about Marxism. But tonight's sort of a special event, I guess, in Real Talk, because earlier today I was on a panel with the ever brilliant Carlos Garrido and Radical Desai and Gabriel Rockhill and others. That it was fantastic. It was all about the intellectual and the working class and why that relationship just ain't there anymore in our particular situation. But there were a few technical difficulties on the on the setup side since, for anyone who's not aware, Radica and Alan just moved to London, and so things sort of got lost in the mix, and we ended up having to stream it on the dot. So things couldn't be set up beforehand, and unfortunately, you missed my presentation. There was no audio for it. So I'm thinking what I'll do is give that presentation because I think it's a relatively good one, at least in my humble opinion. And I think it points at real problems on the left today. So we're going to get to that and a whole lot more right after the international. My bad. That wasn't the international at all.
Cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.
All right, now we're back. I apologize for that. Look at me messing up the intro as always. So before we get into this presentation from this panel, I notice some things as I go through social media. Sometimes I tend to waste the clock while I'm at work by, going through Twitter and social media, stuff like that. And that's where I get a lot of sort of my notions of how people that may be new to this stuff are thinking, because they're, maybe not organizing yet. And so they're really just left on the internet. And I posted a tweet so that I didn't think would be very controversial, as it's, basic Marxism. But there were a lot of confused people responding to it. And, of course, like most of this stuff, the sort of bot armies and trolls get a hold of it and say all kinds of really silly stuff. So there's that. But within that, there's a lot of confusion about the general distortions of Marxism and people that have unfortunately fallen into a lot of these distortions. And I thought it might be good to take a look at this, because that's a lot of what my presentation from the panel earlier was actually about, was the modern day distorters of Marxism, like the ones that were being criticized in Lenin's time, that Lenin really ripped into pretty hard. So I'm gonna share my screen here, and we'll get to it. I want to show you just real quick. Okay, here we go. All right, so what you're seeing here is my tweet, and I'll click on the whole thing. It just says communism is not forcing everyone to be equal. It's not a classless, moneyless, stateless society or a predetermined form we try to force reality to become. And communism is the real movement of history. It is the return to the community on a higher stage of development. And it is the development of human society to a new stage. And it can be understood through the materialist dialectic, the materialist view of history, or synonymously Marxism, synonymously Marxism-Leninism, or synonymously the general laws of development. I did not, and I'll stop sharing my screen because we don't need it anymore, but I did not think that would be all that controversial, right? This is basic dialectics we're talking about here. But I was very surprised there are a lot of people that were like, no, it is this, moneyless, classless state that we are taking sort of from our minds and imposing our will onto society. And I think that misses the mark of how Marx arrives at this thing beyond a state that Marx and Engels call the withering of the state. So I want to sort of clarify that before I get into this presentation, because I think it's important, right? What Marx is doing is not saying, I am dreaming up this thing called communism, right? Where we will have no state and there will be no money and no class, right? What he's doing is analyzing the real motion of history, how everything that comes into being must go out of being, right? It's basic dialectical logic. And what I was trying to do there was sort of go through the shorthands and dogmas that we're taught a lot of the times when we're still new, or that we're sort of manipulated into thinking a lot of the times and staying there. Because the problem really is ideological, right? It's how we're taught to think, how we're taught to view the world, how we're taught to learn, really. Because think about when you were in school, right? Was your focus on genuinely thinking critically about whatever problem it is you might be examining in school? Or were you taught to memorize, right? You were taught to memorize. We all were. This is a problem of bourgeois ideology, and it arises very naturally in the 17th century out of empiricism, right? As technology is moving forward and advancing, and people are getting all of these new scientific theories and advances, we need a way of viewing it all that can account for that, right? And so empiricism comes up, and it's this very detailed, this is that kind of thing, right? But dialectics, which is way beyond this, goes past this, goes deeper, and understands a thing in its motion, or as Engels tells us, by examining it from its lowest phase to its highest, right? We don't have a definition. We're not definition mongering. We're instead trying to understand the concrete world by getting this abstract thought in our head about it, right? And then adding all of the context and factors that make up that fact. And that's what Marx called the ascension to the concrete, or creating a concrete abstract, the best way and only consistently materialist way of understanding anything, right? So, yeah, that was just a weird thing. I thought, if anyone, and I actually replied to a lot of the people, I always try to, anytime someone tries to, engage with me on social media, I believe that it is upon us as communists to be seen as approaching them professionally and in a kind way that seeks to create understanding rather than dismisses whatever they say. So anytime, even when people approach me in clear bad faith and trolling, I try to rise above that and take it into a real substantive, respectful discussion if I can. Now, obviously, that doesn't always happen, but it's always what I believe we need to try to do. And so this is what I did, right? And I left a little message for anyone who was confused by what I was saying or thought I was wrong to come here right now and ask me any questions they want, right? So here I am. If you genuinely have questions, if you're like, hey, Noah, you're a stupid idiot. Communism is memorizing abstract notions. Come on, ask questions. Tell me, right? We'll hash it out. And I promise you, by the end of the day, we'll both be better off for it. Anyway, all that being said, one other thing. Before I get into this presentation, I think we tried to mention the super chats we had, but I wanted to thank Dino Pantalokis. If I'm pronouncing that right, I apologize if I'm not, who during the panel sent us a super chat. And of course, as always, Cobra Commander, who sent us one as well. So thank you guys. Just so you're aware, the Midwestern Marxist Institute is completely grassroots funded. That's part of the idea of building this People's Institute that belongs to all of us, right? We don't get any funding from any institutions or anything like that. Every dime in our budget comes from you guys, comes from your super chats, your Patreon, all of that stuff. So thank you all so much for your help. And if you want to help out like that, you can find us on patreon.com/MidwesternMarx. You can send a super chat right here. The Patreon will actually give you access to our Discord forever, like even after you quit the Patreon. So if you're looking for a community of principled people learning Marxism and anything like that, come on in. The Discord's really getting going now. We had something of a rough start with it as Eddie and I tried to learn the ins and outs of Discord and the atmosphere, which is frankly a lot of the time worse than the rest of social media, which is saying something, right? But yeah, that's all been smoothed out. We have some awesome people running it right now from the Discord, actually. We are setting up a social media team and graphics team. So if you have any skills and you want to get involved with the Institute, head into that Discord and get a hold of me or anybody else. And there you go. We'll get you involved. So all that being said, I'm going to start this presentation here. Feel free to stop me if you have any questions. It was so full disclosure, I was asked to be on this. And of course I accepted, but I was not told there was a 15-minute time limit. So that really threw me because my presentation is roughly double that. So even as I was going, I was like trying to zoom ahead of where I was to see what I could cut out and what I could get away with not explaining. But it turned out, and we had a really, really good questions and answer segment after the presentations. But it turned out that a lot of the explanations, and I'll get into why we need them, are very relevant, and we all need to go over them every time we talk about this stuff. So yeah, I'll begin by kind of oversharing a bit and making everyone, or at least myself, slightly awkward, because why not, right? I don't know. Honestly, I always get a little overwhelmed when I'm asked to be on a panel like these. So I find it helpful to just get that part over with right away, right? I get a huge case of imposter syndrome. That's the problem. Always, every time, without fail. I mean, here I am, right? With all of these people who spent years and years in the academy, years and years in deep study, and they've got all these fancy degrees and done all this brilliant work. And who am I, right? I'm kind of just a dumb ape who swings a hammer for a living, honestly. I mean, that's literally what I do, right? I swing a hammer for a living. But I'm also a dumb ape who's always sort of had this, I don't know, this kind of thirst, as corny as that sounds, for understanding things and fixing what's wrong, right? That I can't ever seem to quench. And so I'm this dumb ape who wakes up at 4 a.m. every morning and spends the hours before going into work reading. That's, by the way, the only time you get a quiet house when you have a teenage son, 4 a.m. to 7 a.m., give or take, and then starts, the music, the phone, the video games, etc. But I'm not just reading during these hours to entertain myself, right? And I'm reading in order to create a greater understanding of the world around me. And that turns into quite a lot of work, turns into a lot of studying, a lot of writing, going over my own notes and questions and talking with my good friends like Carlos and Eddie about these things, right? And over the years, all of that turns into something else. It turns into at least what I hope are insights, right? And taking all of this stuff that I've been consuming and learning, all of this thinking dialectically and understanding how to ascend to the concrete, what we were talking about earlier, all that, and trying to work out new theory through it, right? New theory that's applicable to our particular time and place in the universe, just as all the theorists were doing in their particular time and place, just as Lenin did and Du Bois did and Marx and Engels and all these people. Not to say that, I'm like Marx. Clearly that's not the case. But that's what I'm attempting to do, create genuine, new, innovative theory that applies to our current conditions, because that's not done yet. And we need that. We need to understand the world we're in and how we got here in order to get out of the crises, right? And that's really hard to do when you're also worried about working enough hours or, swinging enough hammers, in my case, to make sure that the bank doesn't take the house, right? And to make sure that kids have school clothes and that there's actually food in the fridge, even though now it seems to be priced just out of reach for most of us, all that, right? Especially when it seems like work takes more and more from you. And even when there's more dollars in your paycheck, what you end up with as you spend those dollars, that seems to get less and less, don't it? These are daily concerns for hundreds of millions of working class Americans right now. And so when I was asking myself, what could I possibly add to this conversation, right? With so many brilliant people who are very clearly much smarter than myself, I thought that this is what I can add, right? I can add that unique perspective of the working class that, to jargon it up a little, arrives through the socialization of labor and retention of private ownership in pursuit of the creation of surplus value, or at least the unique perspective of a, typical hammer swinging ape that comes out of all that. So that's what I'm going to try to do as we go on. So when we speak of working class in the USA, there's a few clarifications that we need to make before we even get into it these days. And I mean, we need to clarify this every time we talk about class, every single time, because this is part of the problem that we're here to talk about today, right? The schism between the intellectuals and the working class. And a lot of that schism rests on distortion. Oh, I got a good question here. Okay, asked why my teeth are fucked up. I'm working class. I actually have a missing tooth, believe it or not. And I just didn't have dental care. I actually, a little personal history of me. I think, was it last week, I hit 17 years clean off of heroin. I was addicted to heroin for years and years and years. During this time, there were a lot of problems happened. It's a whole thing, right? But this is a common problem for the working class, not being able to get the healthcare that we need, right? So good question. Thank you. Anyway, back to what I was saying. Where was I? The unique perspective, right? To jargon it up a little, of working class people. It arrives through the socialization of labor and retention of private ownership in pursuit of the creation of surplus value, right? Or at least the unique perspective of me, the typical hammer swinging ape that comes out of all that, right? So as we think of this specific thing, we need to clarify what working class is in the USA every single time, because that schism between the intellectuals and working class, it rests on the distortions that create the need to clarify this. So one of the reasons the schism stays separated, one of the reasons for this separation seems to be that the left has largely forgotten what a working class even is, right? And it does this because it has forgotten how to analyze class through the Marxist method, the ascension to the concrete. And that's been here almost from the beginning, really. There's exceptions, of course, but largely we've had a problem with dogmatism since Marxism arose in this country. This is one way we get to distortions and mistakes, that dogmatism of mechanism, all the biggies. There's a quote from Lenin from the first part of his State and Revolution that really sums up the phenomenon really well. Because as we all know, history repeats itself first as tragedy and then as farce, right? Lenin says, today, the bourgeoisie and the opportunists within the labor movement concur in this doctoring of Marxism. They omit, obscure, or distort the revolutionary side of this theory, its revolutionary soul. They push to the foreground and extol, and this is important, what is or seems acceptable to the bourgeoisie. All the social chauvinists are now Marxists. Don't laugh, right? Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful quote. Let's see here. I'm seeing through. Okay, no more questions. Good. Okay, carrying on. This seems to be happening in a new form. Of course it is, right? Obviously, new thing. But it corresponds to the advance of the imperialist system to its fully financialized form and bourgeois ideology into its wokest form that comes out of that. And that's often what it's called of the 21st century, right? This ideology that the bourgeoisie shift into. That's the stage we're in now, right? A difference really between the two is only in form. Essentially speaking, this is the same phenomenon as we enter into a new era, just as the Bolsheviks did, right? We see new forms of the same essential phenomena. Owing to the general laws of development, Marxism itself is a study of, right, on a higher stage of development. In a particular American decaying imperialist form of capitalism, right? And so it has different particular characteristics. Our distorters, our falsifiers, they're not even necessarily in the labor movement like Lenin's were, right? As our labor movement, especially its radical at one time majority, was sort of hacked to pieces in the last period of history. Now, of course, we're seeing a new re-radicalization there with things like Sean Fain's UAW, Chris Smalls in the ALU and all that. And I've got to point there to more of the parallels of Russia entering a revolutionary era and their trade union movement exploding with militancy as well. But of course, ours is on a higher stage of development, right? But I'm off track. Let me get back to it. Our distorters and falsifiers, they're not part of this resurgent labor movement. They're instead part of the left, And that gives what they say even less teeth, as this left is largely divorced from the working classes, and so it's completely powerless to enact any real change. I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot just on my own. So anyway, the bourgeoisie and opportunists in the left, whom I genuinely hope are watching this right now, you know who you are. They certainly concur in this doctoring and distorting of Marxism, just as those opportunists in Lenin's day agreed with that doctoring and distorting of Marxism. These new distorters, fakes, and frauds, many of them connected to establishment institutions like the academy, the media, NGOs, and think tanks, or as Professor Rockhill, who was there on the panel, put it, the knowledge production apparatus of the ruling class. But they're also within organizations that call themselves socialist and sometimes even communist. These distorters and fakes, they omit, obscure, and distort not only the revolutionary soul of Marxism in this new, more fully developed form of bourgeois society, they distort absolutely everything about it. They steal our symbols and our heroes, and like Kautsky tried to do with Marx, turn them into common liberals. They use revolutionary sounding words to continually advocate for the ruling class. Or maybe a little more precisely, they live in the world of abstract words, and in this way are used by the ruling class to enforce their ideological and theoretical concerns, which are at the same time practical concerns, becoming the vanguard of finance capital. And when working class people hear this essential message, but dressed in clothing that says revolutionary or communist or left or whatever, that creates a big, fat, planet-sized problem. And this, by the way, is without even getting into the particular corporate media narratives and how expertly they use this. It's not getting into the charlatans like Jordan Peterson or James Lindsay, for example, who are then able to talk about how actually the ruling class are all Marxists and communists, and they're pushing their communist agenda on our children. People see that, right? And they see things actually being pushed on our children, such as in public schools, in the media, all over, right? But then they can easily believe these slick hucksters who tell them it's Marxism and communism. So they stay as far away from us as possible. And rightly so, if that was what we are. But it isn't what we are, right? And so it keeps working people away from the only real weapons we have for our own liberation. This is why the proletariat largely ignores what they see as left at the best of times, or even wants nothing to do with it at the worst. Because what is presented to them as left is exactly what the ruling class is giving them. And the distorters and falsifiers I mentioned earlier do nothing but reinforce this. To use a favorite phrase of Jordan Peterson, there is a problem with, quote, postmodern neo-Marxists. And despite the programmed falsifier response that dismisses these valid concerns by the same ideological mistake of similar sounding language they always lean on, calling it a Nazi conspiracy theory, they are powerful. They are real. The issue is they are not Marxists, right? They're rabid anti-communists. And we need to figure out a way to draw a line between them and us for good. But that was a big, long ramble, right? I was discussing multiple distortions, and we need to clear up those distortions. Sorry for that obsession I have with having to understand and fix everything. It apparently finds expression in long rambles all the time. So I apologize. Anyway, I'm just trying to scroll through at the same time, make sure there aren't questions that I'm missing. Welcome everybody who's watching. Thank you for being here with us tonight. Stick around because we're just getting started. One of the primary distortions in our era is that of what class is. Yeah, it's that big, right? The left has forgotten what class itself is. Seriously. Because of this new form of that same problem Lenin was dealing with. Because of the distorters, many middle-class people and Repr-proletarians by extension genuinely see them, or I'm sorry, not Repr-proletarians, different part. Many middle-class people genuinely see themselves as working class. This mistake is ideological of one-sided empiricism and going by the definition, which puts the idea of a fully formed thing before the content of what creates it, or in this instance, before what creates the proletariat. It tells them that they sell labor power, or, usually the vulgarization they consider labor power. And so therefore they are proletarians, definition fulfilled, right? This is not an ascension to the concrete, my friends. This is lazy thinking typical of the middle classes. It rests on the surface with no necessity. It is definition mongering, really. And if we know our angles, we know that definitions are never enough. Never. We must instead understand things from their lowest stage to their highest if we are to speak of understanding them on a real material level, or really to understand them at all. Class, from the Marxist perspective, is a reflection in social relations that we must enter into in order to produce all the things that make society, right? Determined by the way we make those things, right? There is no proletariat without the bourgeoisie and the creation and accumulation of surplus value. And therefore, no essential characteristics of the proletariat that it takes on due to the way that surplus value is created and accumulated. And so class can only be part of that relationship. But something happens to our proletariat around the mid-20th century, right? During this time, huge swaths of our working class lost its proletarian character due to a combination. Oh, you know what? I'm seeing a question. So let me get to that and we'll return to this after we get the question. Red American asks, do you think the isolation of the ruling class's children from the masses in conjunction with the incentives of capitalism contributes to the formation of egocentricity amongst them? Yes, absolutely, of course. But remember, this is like all of everything that they're surrounded by, building what they become, right? It is the need for capital to accumulate. It is the need to monopolize in our era. And also, there is the proletarian push against it to consider, right? Why wokeism specifically, right? It's a reactionary view that comes out of the forward momentum of the civil rights revolution, right? It's the bourgeoisie attempting to deal with the fact that the black proletariat stood up and took its liberties, right? Took its rights away from the bourgeoisie who were holding them ransom. I mean, that's a, simplification and vulgarization of the process, but that's what happened. And so all of this goes into building modern bourgeois world outlooks and ideology. That's a great question, though. Thank you, Red American. So what happens to our working class in the mid-20th century? During this time, huge swaths of it lose its proletarian character due to a combination of things that I didn't have time in the panel really to get into. But at the end of the day, it ends up being a product of one class struggle, right? Combined with the maturation of capitalism into its imperialist phase, right? The beginning of imperialism, creating the centralization of capital necessary for it to be carried out. This huge swath rises up into a working middle class at this time, having secured for itself, not given to by finance or industrial capital, secured for itself through struggle, right? Some measure of stability and the ability to save money and not use its wages up consuming the basic necessities. I was able to buy homes. And this comes with debt, which is a large part of what's happening now, but we'll get into that. In a word, it won the American dream, right? When we add the advance of technology and globalization to the mix, we get what's often called the PMC, or professional managerial class, thrown in there. And we end up with the late 20th century's middle classes, living that American dream. The white picket fence around the nice house in the suburbs, the retirement plan, the 2.5 kids and the dog, or 2.5 dogs and a kid, or whatever it was. I forget what gets chopped in half. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about, right? The American dream. But that dream is effectively dead in the 21st century. Or maybe a little more precisely, it's been murdered with thousands of tiny knives stabbing it over and over again throughout the years as imperialism advanced into this fully financialized stage. And the corpse is now on full display for the American people to see. I have a theoretical pamphlet on this phenomenon that's coming out very soon. It's actually finished being written, by the way. But this is part of the general problem we're discussing. And so we need to know a little bit about it in order to understand what I'm going to talk about a little bit further down. This is what we at the Midwestern Marx Institute called Repr-proletarianization. Now, Repr-proletarianization is nothing other than the same process as the original proletarianization during the advance of industrial capitalism, but on a higher stage of development. Just as the stable middle-class peasants of the early industrial era were proletarianized as the forces of production outmoded the old relations of production and industrial capitalism came into being, our working middle classes are losing that stability and falling down to the level of the proletariat due to a very similar process with many of the same essential outcomes of being proletarian, such as the inability to accumulate anything past means of consumption, or to put it in common language that we hear all the time, struggling paycheck to paycheck and unable to afford a $500 emergency. Now, the problem is, this is no longer the progressive era of industrial capitalism, is it? It is instead a decaying moribund stage of fully financialized imperialist capitalism, where profits are primarily made through speculation and arbitrage by the financial bourgeoisie. Of course, surplus value is still created, commodity production is still generalized underlying everything, right? But this gigantic shift that hits a nodal point in 2008, it changes everything. It accelerates the process that began back in the 70s and gives us a downward momentum of the middle classes. But there are no longer giant factories of the industrial bourgeoisie to take people in. Not in the US of A, there ain't, right? Those jobs are long gone. And the unions built by their workers are long gone. I'm going to go through the chat a little bit and take a quick break, and then we'll get right back into it. Yeah. So people are kind of going over what working class means, right? And this, we sort of covered this in the discussion and questions, right? That we need to go back to our basic Marxism for everything. And we need to clarify what class even means every time we talk about it, right? Because the working class arises in a determinate form. It isn't just some universal abstract. Those don't exist, right? And we also need to understand the difference in language, right? What does working class mean and what does proletariat mean? Because sometimes we do use them synonymously. And then other times we use working class to mean everyone who's in a class that works. And so we have to take clues from context on this, right? But if you're ever wondering what I'm doing at a particular time, just ask, I'll tell you. It's not a big deal. As long as we're understanding what each other are saying, the genuine content, and not trying to superimpose our own subjective view onto someone else, we'll be good, right? Anyway, so what happens to people as reproletarianization hits them? They begin searching for solutions to the problem, right? Solutions to the impossibility of continuing on in the old way. And what are they greeted with? They're greeted with the middle class left of the last period of history, who unfortunately still dominate many organizations and institutions. They're greeted with the distorters and opportunists. They are greeted, in a word, by reaction dressed as revolution. Now, I'm sure that I say this in the thing, the other panelists can explain how this exactly came about much better than I can, especially Carlos just really exposes the ideological problems in his book, The Purity Fetish, that I believe is one of the most important books of our era. And it was an absolute honor to be able to edit that book. Gabriel Rockhill describes the sort of history of it happening and has done so much research into the actual forms it's taken and why. All of that. There are way better sources for that than I am. So basically what I want to focus on instead is twofold, right? How this affects the original traditional proletariat, of which there's still a big chunk of people within, right? And how it affects the Repr-proletariat, which is already far more numerous and is only coming into being right now, right? As for the proletariat, since this is sort of where I come from, the east side of Cleveland, sitting in the shadows of the rusted out auto plants, choking on the sulfur-tinted smoke of the steel mills. I'd like to tell a story from my own life or, my own lived experience, to use a favorite jargon of the middle class left. At the Institute, we often joke that these organizations are run like HR departments. It's a joke that's really only funny, though, because it's true, right? There's a reason for that as well. That reason is its class character. Middle classes, as Marx teaches us, they can't really see out of the middle. They see themselves as above all class antagonisms, to quote Marx directly, right? The stability that's inherent within their position and ability to do more than struggle paycheck to paycheck creates a lack of necessity. And as Marx teaches us, it is necessity that drives the creation of class consciousness and creation of a revolutionary agent, no matter what era we're talking about. Middle classes, they just don't have that these days. And so they have the luxury of a purity fetish. They have the luxury of policing language, right? And cannibalizing themselves to the point of inaction or even action on behalf of the ruling class. Because despite all their big talk, as Carlos pretty much proves without a doubt in his book, they aren't really interested in revolution. And I want to address the chat for a minute who are saying the term middle classes is incorrect and it should be petty bourgeoisie. That's actually not the case. Marx and Engels use the term middle classes all the time, right? All the time. 18th Premier is my favorite example because this is where he talks about the middle classes believing they're above all class antagonism. But Engels goes over it pretty thoroughly in his Conditions of the Working Class in England, all that kind of stuff, right? So just never take for granted what anyone on the internet is telling you, right? Just look for yourself. I mean, I learned about the Marxist view of middle classes from reading Marx and Engels. And Deepwalt here says something beautiful on the subject. I'm going to pull this up, brother. The petty bourgeoisie is only one type of middle class. There are other middle classes besides them, right? And they would argue that what we call the PMC is a middle class today. Absolutely well said. That's spot on. Precisely. Anyway, all of this lack of necessity, right? It leads these middle class leftists to a very Proudhonist foundation of how they see everything, right? According to their own subjective views of eternal justice, which Engels, by the way, in the working class in England stuff, just rips apart. Beautiful work. Anyway, but this is how they see it, right? It's then reinforced for them as they come into this by the distorters and the falsifiers. And this is something that fascinates me about the way they think. I mean, seriously, it amazes me. I see it time after time, and I can only say fascinating. It's wild. They seem to have the ability to turn every subjective view they have, every opinion, into an objective fact that exists outside of themselves. I'm sure I don't have to explain the ideological issue to you guys, but this is an integral part of how the purity fetish becomes concrete in this case. I want to do a quick example, right? The last time I was on a panel with these same organizations, we talked about a brand name. And if you know me, I talk about brand dismissal and brand ideology all the time, right? In the era of monopoly finance capital, right? One of the reflections of this monopolization is that branding comes first, right? You think of Nike before you think of quality shoe. You could have a quality shoe that's the same quality, but if it's not a Nike, it's a different thing. The brand always comes first. And so the reflection of this in social life finds form in how people dismiss things with labels, right? So one of the labels that I have a problem with and I need to like force myself not to dismiss things is, you guessed it, middle class, right? But new brands pop up all the time. So the last time we did one of these panels, we talked about a very hip, trendy brand dismissal word that they'd come up with, right? So I'm sorry, I spaced for a minute. Yeah, there was a new one that was somehow, nowhere and then everywhere all at once. Everyone was saying it, which is suspicious enough on its own. That term was Pat Sock, right? Do you guys remember that one? Now, this term was used by these same exact people that we already know as falsifying and doctoring Marxism, right? And they do it with this to instill national nihilism and an aversion to their own people in all of the young Repr-proletarians getting radicalized that it could touch. The Marxist view of patriotism has always been the same, right? Always, going back to the very beginning, as it's based in the basic Marxist analysis of what makes a nation, what makes a people, what makes everything, really. For Marxism, there is no such thing, and this is important. For Marxism, excuse me, I can't talk tonight. For Marxism, there is no such thing as an abstract universality, right? No individual liberal human subject that's removed from the world, the material foundation in society that creates them, right? Even though the people that oh man, I lost my place. I'm sorry. Let me find it again. Oh yeah. Okay. Even though that's like the people who brought the brand name Pat Sock around believe that's pure liberalism, though. For Marxism, a universal is only a universal because it is. Oh man, I cannot talk. I am so sorry. For Marxism, a universal is only a universal because it has taken on a particular determinate form, right? This is true of everything. Every universal is rooted in the particular form in which it arises. Internationalism, right, which is what they mistake their abstract liberalism for, is the shared material condition of each national particularity. There is no exception to this, none, as J.B. Stalin himself pointed out so long ago. And so for Marxism, communism, socialism, communist, socialist, all of it is always inherently patriotic. And so we can track these brands, right? These brand dismissals, such as Pat Sock, that pop up to their sources. Well, we can find ourselves the enemy. Lenin, Stalin, Mao, they all make these statements about patriotism and the enemies of the people, right? That the only true patriotism of the bourgeois epoch is with communists. This makes no sense for someone coming directly. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that, y'all. Old microphone. I apologize. Yeah, probably. Anyway, where was I? I'm so sorry, guys. I was just starting to get on a roll, right? Anyway, let's find my place. Oh yeah, okay. So they can't see the basic view of what the basic Marxist view of what a nation is, right? They can't see the basic Marxist view of what a people is and how this is a material thing. They can't see that how Marxism sees as the defining factor that which is nascent and coming into being within a contradiction. And so they mistake the already developed aspect of this contradiction, in this case, the brutality of the American bourgeoisie, as all that it is, right? This is something our middle class friends just can't understand, is they confuse their subjective view, lacking analysis of class struggle and American society existing as a contradiction in the process of overcoming itself, for an objective view, right? And what really grinds my gears about this, what just bothers me to no end, is that they pretend to speak for marginalized people while doing this, right? They pretend to speak for the working class as well. Now, I'm from one of the poorest areas in the poorest large city in the nation, and American flags line the streets where I'm from. In fact, there are studies showing that the poorer one is, the more positively they associate with patriotism and with this country. What they see in this symbol, a flag, right, is something far different than what the middle class left sees. And for this crime of a different view, of seeing this symbol, in this symbol, something about themselves and the country that creates them, their shared experience as a people, right? Along with, the ideals that this nation was supposedly founded upon, but that the bourgeois mode of life just inherently prevents, right? Ideals of liberty and hard work, of equality under the law. I mean, how the Statue of Liberty's poem sums it up, right? Keep ancient lands your storied pomp. Give us instead your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. That could have been written by Stalin himself. And for this crime of seeing these things instead, right? Millions upon millions of Americans from every community we've got are called evil Nazis by the falsifiers, right? Looked down on for not being as enlightened as the middle class left believes that it is. But that's just one example. In our era, and by the way, let's call it what it is, this social chauvinism takes the form of wokeism, which can best be described by pointing you at sort of the diversity, equity, inclusion programs you'll see on any college campus. This isn't a dive into more modern bourgeois ideology and how it's changed in the 21st century, though. I'm just sort of setting the tone for my story, explaining what kind of forces we're dealing with here. So anyway, here's my story. For anyone who doesn't know me well, I've been in all types of organizing over the years. I'm a member of the Communist Party. I'm very, very active in my community, my neighborhood, and in my shop at work. And that's only since I've gotten back into all this kind of stuff. I'm an old man now, right? So this is, years down the line from when I started. So I've been in more than a few left meetings. And I can tell you right now that it is only a middle-class culture that is tolerated there. It is only a middle-class culture that is tolerated. And that is absolutely alienating to the proletariat. Absolutely alienating. The intolerance and hyper-individualism and the social chauvinism of the middle classes, which sees itself as enlightened, looks down on all of us as irredeemably backwards and stupid and in need of its enlightened leadership for it to tell us what time it is. All that kind of thing, right? I don't have to explain the purity fetish to anyone here, I'm sure, but this is a primary expression of it, right? And almost all of these are run according to strictures that, believe it or not, and there are studies about this, were created in corporate boardrooms. Corporate boardrooms, right? No one in a so-called Communist Party, socialist organization, whatever you're in, should be using these things conceived of in corporate boardrooms for corporations, right? That's just my opinion on it, though. Anyway, All of this is why it feels like a meeting with HR, because these things like the progressive stack and all of the privilege walk type workshops, all of it was designed by corporations and NGOs, right? By bourgeois institutions. And they're all designed from this sort of social consciousness, what Michael Parenti used to call the anything but class, or the McCarthyite left. It's the middle class inability to see class arriving in concrete form. And so it sees all manner of difference and demands deference to difference, but it can't see what's right in front of them, right? That all of this difference is what unites us. Different forms of class struggle, of humanity itself, really. But that's neither here nor there. I'm a dedicated guy, right? A hard worker. So I sit through these HR meetings and I deal with them because I believe we're capable of overcoming these problems. But here's the rub. Because these forces refuse to embrace their own liberalism and present them and insist on pretending they're communists, the language of communists is still present in some form. And so the working class are really an abstract, they call workers that they despise the moment it becomes concrete. That's still there, right? And so the only actual proletarian, and so as the only actual proletarian in many of these meetings, man, I've been asked more times than I can count. Noah, you always talk about your coworkers. You tell us they were all mostly Trump voters and libertarians, and now all of them are on board for socialism. Why don't you ever bring them here? It's a good question, right? Truth is, I can't ever answer it because I can't ever answer it honestly. Answering them honestly would get me sent down to the head of HR so fast it's not even funny. Because the truth is, one of the fatal flaws that the lack of necessity inherent within the remnants of these more stable middle classes has is an inability to address its own flaws. And the truth in regards to their question is that I'm embarrassed of them. I'm embarrassed of how unserious the left has become, and embarrassed of how easily fooled by distortions the people who say they want to be communists have become. If I brought any of my coworkers, all of whom did vote Trump, and all of whom are on board for socialism, because I've been able to explain to them over time what these things actually mean, they would sit there for about 5 minutes. Then the first time they were told about a progressive stack, or, the dude with the giant bushy beard was told to give his pronouns, or lectured on what words they were allowed to say, or any of that, any of the other parts, these organizations that function exactly like mandatory company meetings with HR, they would get up and they would leave, and I would never hear the end of it at work. Right? And that needs to change because nobody wants to deal with HR. And that's not saying that people that have different pronouns are wrong. Not even slightly. It's saying that we are given these narratives, these categories, these brand association dismissals. And that right there, all that says to working class people is ruling class. That's it. That's all it says. All it's ever going to say. So we need to find a different way to go about these things. Because again, nobody wants to deal with HR. The proletariat has necessity. Necessity. There are real struggles in the proletariat, right? As I mentioned a few minutes ago, everything's getting more expensive. And our wages, they ain't getting any better. They're getting worse, in fact. We need to worry about the bank not taking the house, about making sure the kids have food on the table. We don't even have time to worry about our own feelings, let alone to consider everyone else's and walk on eggshells the whole time around them because they're sensitive to language. And so it is absolutely insulting to tell a working class single mother living in a trailer park that she needs to shut up and listen or check her privilege because actually she's an oppressor and she didn't even know it. So she should probably decolonize her mind because her great-grandparents emigrated here from Ireland, then lived in ghettos and worked the same crappy jobs all immigrants work their whole lives, right? And just while we're on the subject, The middle class slogan of decolonize your mind is so ridiculously social chauvinist, putting the onus for the struggle against colonialism and imperialism on the nice feelings of the middle class and not the class struggle of the colonized is not just wrong, but incredibly condescending, a new form of what we called white man's burden racism. And that's the proletariat, right? That's the rub with the proletariat. Here's the rub with the Repr-proletariat. The Repr-proletariat is falling out of the middle classes. And so when they begin looking around, seeing that society is set up in a way to leave them in an impossible situation, they begin thinking they should maybe do something about it, right? What are they greeted with, though? They're greeted with that middle class left, the intellectuals, the liberals, and distorters who reinforce the ideological baggage they still carry with them from those middle classes, who really own the left organizations and institutions, and who all of mainstream media and really society in general tells them are the ones to go to for what they call activism, right? Let's not even get started on the action for action's sake aspect of this, or we'll be here all day. The Repr-proletariat arriving on the left and being greeted by this atmosphere is absolutely damaging to its ability to actualize itself as a conscious class, as all of that ideological baggage it simply has with it that comes naturally out of its descent from the middle classes. It's not combated by a disciplined and scientifically advanced Communist Party who enforce a more proletarian and collective atmosphere. It is instead reinforced and encouraged by the exact problems we've gone over, while at the same time being called a proletarian and collective atmosphere. It turns the entire thing into a fashion show, constant cannibalism and comparison. What the right is absolutely correctly called the oppression Olympics. I mean, don't get me wrong, I hate George Orwell as much as the next guy. But if you can give me a better example of the Orwellian notion that removing the substance of language removes the ability to think about things and allows the ruling class a greater hand in social engineering, which is precisely what this is, then I'll eat my goddamn shoe right now. I will. Okay. No? Nobody? Carrying on. So what do we do about it? Well, for the part of the solution, I think we need to look to what turned the early Communist Party around. Turned it from a small group of intellectuals and petty bourgeoisie into what it was at the height of its power. The first ever integrated political organization in the United States of America. The builder of the CIO, the home of W.E.B. Du Bois. And Reclaim Deison, stop telling me to name names. Never have we done that. We always talk in the general and let people see it for themselves. We don't tell people what time it is. We provide them with directions to the watch store. So shut up or I will shut you up. Sorry, I don't mean to get upset. Get me off track, man. Come on, you're repeating yourself. Anyway, we're talking about the when the Communist Party was powerful, right? When it built the CIO, when it was the home of W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, at the Extraordinary Conference, I think it was in 36. Could be wrong. It could be 32, though. Anyway, it was called the Extraordinary Conference, right? The Communist Party looks at itself, right? And it's sort of through the education in Marxism that it was undergoing at the time, being trained by the Soviets, it was able to see the same problem that we have now. Wait a minute. This is a middle-class organization. So how do we change that? They asked themselves that question. They genuinely did. And I want to remark on the genuine dedication and discipline it takes to actually address that question, because it's avoided like the plague on the left right now. And I want to put all our focus onto it. Anyway, through that education and discipline, which is really what won them the respect to even call themselves communists, they were able to change the atmosphere of the organization to one that was actually welcoming and invited the proletariat and didn't alienate it. But frankly, I don't think any left organizations are at that point yet. We're just not. We need to be real about what our problems are. We must start somewhere else then. Because of that rampant falsification and distortion, we must start with education. And that is where you guys, or the people I was speaking to in the panel, the intellectuals, come in. The big problem we have as communists is that nobody knows who we are, because we can't separate ourselves from those distorters. And so this needs to change. We must draw a hard line between the distortions and the real deal. And that line is done by actually teaching people what that real deal is. What was it Lenin said? Give him 5 months with the youth and he'd give you Bolsheviks for life. Well, give me 5 Carlos Garridos or 5 Radical Desais, and I will give you Bolsheviks for life. This is the job of intellectuals. This is how we reestablish that connection. It requires a type of humility only a real communist can even possess, because it requires the teacher to realize that their student is the revolutionary subject and not him or herself, right? And it requires the student to recognize that they can go nowhere without the teacher. But that's not all it requires. It requires a recognition in both that the student is the teacher and the teacher is the student. That the communist does not lead the masses lead the communist. And that requires setting aside everything that even remotely smells like the distorters and falsifiers, because it requires an intimate understanding of how modern bourgeois ideology functions and how it is spread. It requires an understanding that the brand comes first in the minds in our era. And so anything that can trigger that brand of the ruling class, that's a problem. We cannot sound like the falsifiers, and we cannot sound like the ruling class. We must have people that are able to engage with this on a deep theoretical level that can teach it to the rest of us. If I had some sort of dictatorial power, I would dictate that everything other than education and that activism, which is absolutely mandatory, like the Palestine Solidarity Movement, be dropped immediately. Everything other than those. And we would spend at least a year, learning the basics of Marxism. And here's why. You know how the old party was able to maintain that discipline? Everyone was on the same page for the basics. Only when we all know only when we all know exactly what a Marxist analysis is, can we spot distortion and recuperation. Only when we can all ascend to the concrete can we watch the abstract or an infiltrator and stop it in its tracks before it does any damage. If we all have the Marxist worldview and method, then we are infiltration proof. As Marxism, actual Marxism can only lead to class struggle, and class struggle can only, in this case, lead to revolution. Usually, I would have some witty remark to end one of these with, right? But that's just, I'm going to end it here because I'm done, right? Education. And then I thank them for their time, etc. Yeah, that's it. That was the presentation. Oh, Reclaim Davidson actually makes a good point. Except Harry Haywood, the entire split where it lost the entire black movement to the new left. Very true. Very true. The black freedom struggle sort of took a new left turn, right? And why? Because the Communist Party wasn't good enough to get it, right? Wasn't good enough to lead that struggle, even though it had some of the best members of the black freedom struggle. Du Bois, Henry Winston, Patterson. I mean, legendary people, brilliant thinkers, heroic communists, not enough, right? So there was something missing. And it didn't come from Haywood and his ultra-leftism. Haywood was kicked out for a good reason, right? He was wrecking That's what he was doing. And theoretically, the party was correct, right? And we see as the civil rights revolution matures and changes everything, that it was Winston coming out of Du Bois that was correct, right? That the American people were becoming the American people. Yeah, that's about it. Unless anyone has any questions, we can end it here. I mean, I'm willing to go a little longer. Yeah, Covert Commander says, to me, it's simple, put tankies in charge. But yeah, I think Reclaim Dayson is still a little onside Harry Haywood, but look into the whole controversy. Don't just take his book word for word, especially knowing that there's over 300 pages of the book that was left out, right? It had some really cool, his book actually has some really cool descriptions of how the School of the Toilers of the East worked within the Soviet Union because the party sent him there, right? But it's very clear that he wasn't approaching the question of class struggle even dialectically, right? And that's an issue. If we cannot see society for what it is, we can't understand anything because it all comes out of that. It's the sort of oh, okay, we got a super chat here. Larry Shoemaker says, would you support a communist Eurasian state? I'm not sure exactly what you mean. Do you mean something like a new Soviet Union? Of course, we like Marx said, right, that we support all progressive movements of the working classes. And that seems like what it would be. So there are some, technicalities that come into being as sort of national liberation struggles take place. And Stalin gets into this quite a bit in his On the National Question, which is part of his collection. And he talks about how not all national liberation struggles are progressive struggles. Some are pushing the class struggle forward, but some are not. And that we need to be careful and analyze them as they come, right? Deepo, thank you, by the way, for the $2, Larry. I'll say it again. We get zero funding. Every dime in our budget comes from y'all, so it is massively appreciated. Anytime y'all do this, right? Anyway, I'm sorry. It's like a little of a weird day for me. So I usually try to keep my speech very professional. I'm noticing I'm dropping a lot of y'alls and going hard R's and dropping T's and stuff like that. So I apologize for that. I'm going to try to speak so you guys can actually understand me. Anyway, Deepo asks, Noah, how does exploitation fit into your theory of class? Well, it's part of how everything functions, right? The creation of value. It's just Marxism. As class develops, right? Or these particular classes develop, rather. They develop as a reflection of the contradiction already inherent within production, right? The creation of surplus value and the accumulation of capital requires exploitation, right? But this exploitation, Marx calls the two forms, debt and labor, right? Or surplus value, whatever. And so now the Repr-proletariat is in contradiction not with the industrial capitalists like we in the proletariat are, but because they're not creating surplus value per se. They're, in low-wage service jobs, right? They're in debt, which is a big part of how their exploitation functions. Their contradiction is with the fully financialized imperialist bourgeoisie. It's sort of a dual exploitation of both types that we're experiencing. And I'm describing it rather poorly right now, so I apologize. I hope that helps. My pamphlet is actually done being written, though. So as soon as we get this next book out, that's the next thing being sent to the publishing arm and getting taken care of. We need to get some artwork for it. But other than that, it's good to go. So when that comes out, read that, because I go into all of it in pretty good detail. Thank you for a great question, and I will embrace my roots. Sean Moon, thank you so much for the $20, brother. No, the Rust Belt has been traumatized by the destruction of the middle class. Very true. Much dysfunction and addiction. Can you talk about helping the damaged regain self-respect and discipline through Marxist class consciousness? Yeah, that is a huge question, brother. And it's a very personal one for me. So I'll be real with y'all. In my early 20s, let me back up. I'll take your question up, but thank you so much, Sean. When I was younger, I grew up in a Marxist, pro-Soviet household. Very anti-Chinese, by the way, since, it was a Sino-Soviet split era just ending, and we were Soviets. My family was from the Soviet Union, so of course, right? So I become sort of jaded with the whole thing, right? I didn't see the only people I saw who like even knew what they were talking about were old people, like my dad. And I'm like, well, they're leaving us nothing. It's all pointless, blah, blah, blah. I got very nihilistic. I moved to Los Angeles telling my parents I was going to be an anarchist. For real. And joined a pop punk band that I was actually in a video we did for, well, another band I was in a video that we did for MTV, and I will never, ever tell you guys the name of that band. But, during this time, I'm very nihilistic. I'm like in this like blah, and I, become a rock and roll cliche. I got addicted to heroin, and this really, I think, helps me understand lumpenization and what the lumpen proletariat even is, right? Because this is a term that's so misused on the left by these distorters we were talking about. Some people use it to mean black people. I've actually heard that, which is disgusting and racist. Others use it to mean the lowest strata of the working classes. But what it really means is all those people who previously held whatever class position, from bourgeois to proletariat to whatever, being declassed, getting the relationships that they enter into in order to engage in the production that gives us our determinate form of society. They are thrust underneath these relationships into the world of crime and drugs and all of that stuff. And it changes the way that you have to interact with people. Fundamentally, it becomes this very parasitic relationship that you're in with everyone around you. You're using other people and they're using you. Everything needs to get something out of it. It's a very gross, destructive social consciousness that it forces upon you, right? And that was me. I destroyed so. Sorry. It's kind of a touchy subject. I did so many things that I will carry the shame of for, my entire life. I cheated, I stole, I lied, I hurt people for money. You may not know this about me, but I was a fighter back in the day. So yeah, not proud of it, right? And one of the ways I rationalize the hate that I brought into the world, that I deal with it, that I did that shit, right? Now, 17 years later, completely a new man, living a different life, back in the proletariat, is that I give back, right? I try to make up for the damage I caused by building new things, by adding love to the world, right? By, for example, one of my favorite things that I organized in my neighborhood is Thanksgiving dinner plan for people in the, well, we can only get it in the two lowest tax brackets, but we wanted to give it to everybody. But yeah, so people, the majority of the people in my neighborhood, the city, we use funds from the city, and we drive around and deliver everyone stuff to make a Thanksgiving dinner every year, right? Or the organizing thing to, during COVID, go and get elderly people their medicine, that kind of stuff. That kind of stuff really helps. And that's what helped me. But that's like long term. Now that's how I live my life now. And I have sort of a code. And I wrote an article on this called "Walking the Walk," if anyone's interested in it. The way I believe that in order to actually build something real, we must conduct ourselves as communists. So check that out. If you're new to that whole thing, I would say you need to find an obsession. No joke. You need something consuming that is going to fill the void that leaving those drugs behind leaves in your life. Yeah, I saw a few more questions. Thank you for that so much. Devo, that's another one. Are you familiar with Ian Goff's essay analyzing productive and unproductive labor from Marx? It's replete with quotations from all three capitals. Yeah, so I'm not, but I think the question of productive and unproductive labor is a really important one, right? And Marx does go through this throughout all three volumes, and well, really, it's Engels doing it, right? He puts together Marx's notes, and it shows you how brilliant Engels was, right? Because what he does is he gets the dialectical beginning of the process, or Marx's first movement in this context, right? And begins developing it in 2. And then in 3 ties it back, so it becomes the beginning of what Marx described in 1. That's dialectical logic. Beautiful, like almost poetic, the way all 3 volumes of that work, and that Marx only finished the first one and Engels put the other 2 together. Imagine if we had all 8 of Marx's planned volumes of Capital. Imagine the arguments we wouldn't get in. Oh, man. But yeah. So, like, yeah, he talks about, the agents of pure circulation, and he calls service workers, he keeps referring to them as slaves and saying that, they're basically like a machine, and that's how they're treated. And he says that this is going to proliferate, and what did it do? Right? Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm having fun with this, but guys, I think it might be about time to call it a night. I'm sorry. Unless there's any more questions. I got a wife and son out there. However, and I am kind of a family guy now, so I'm going to go spend my Saturday evening with my family. So that being said, I wish you all the best. Look forward to the Repr-proletarianization pamphlet coming out soon. And we are putting on another Basics of Marxism class very, very, very soon. There is one major organization who's sending us a bunch of people. So I'm trying to set it up with them to hopefully do a few in-person classes. This one is not going to be live streamed, though. So if you want in the class, make sure you sign up once we put the sign-ups out. I'm not going to limit it like we did the last one because it was being live streamed. So we'll take as many people as we can get. And yeah, everybody have a great night. And we're going to go out the same way we always do with the International. Bye, everybody.
Cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic